The afternoon light slanted through my study window, catching the floating dust like tiny drifting memories. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a smell that had lived longer in this room than I had. I sat behind my desk, hunched over a stack of yellowed essays written by students I hadn't seen in over 15 years. Sometimes I wondered why I kept them. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just didn't know what else to hold on to. The pen in my hand scratched faintly against the paper as I underlined a line about the Reconstruction era. Ironic, really, given how little I'd managed to reconstruct in my own life after retirement. My house creaked with the tired weight of age. Pipes moaned faintly in the walls. The clock ticked somewhere behind me, and every so often, I could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps downstairs, the soft, careful tread of people who didn't really belong here. My son and his wife had been living with me for 8 months now. 8 long, quiet, suffocating months. Christopher and Edith, my son and daughter-in-law, my family, at least on paper. But family implies warmth, shared laughter, small kindnesses. None of those existed here. The air between us was cold, polite, and thin, like glass that could shatter with the wrong word. When they first moved in, I told myself it was temporary. Christopher had lost his job, a company restructuring, he'd said, and Edith's income barely covered their car payment. I didn't hesitate when he asked to stay. Just until we get back on our feet, he promised. He was my only child. How could I say no? But 8 months later, the temporary had become permanent, and the small irritations of living together had grown into something darker, something that hummed just beneath the surface of our civility. I heard the front door open. The sound was sharp, deliberate, echoing up the staircase like a warning. I froze mid-mark, pen hovering above the page. The steps were quick, paired to 2 sets of shoes coming closer. I sighed, set my glasses on the desk, and waited. Edith appeared in my doorway first, her smile too bright for the dimness of the hall. Christopher stood just behind her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes focused anywhere but me. I noticed the tremor in his jaw before he spoke. "Francis, we need to talk," Edith said, voice syrupy and controlled, like she was performing a role she'd rehearsed. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. "About what?" She stepped into the room without waiting for permission. She always did that, moved through my house as though every space automatically adjusted itself to her presence. Her perfume arrived before she did, too sweet, masking something faintly metallic beneath. Christopher lingered in the doorway, eyes darting from the floor to the window to the bookshelf like he was searching for an escape. He used to look me in the eye when he spoke. Now he couldn't even face me. Edith perched on the arm of my reading chair like she owned it. "We've been thinking," she said lightly, "about family, about how we don't spend enough quality time together." I blinked at her, uncertain whether to laugh or ask what she was really after. "Quality time?" "Yes," she said, "before life gets too busy." "Busy with what?" I asked. "Neither of you have jobs." The smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "You know what I mean, Francis. We're family. We should make memories." My son shifted his weight. "Mom, sorry, Dad," he corrected himself awkwardly. "Remember when we went to Miami when I was 12? You said the ocean looked like liquid glass. I never forgot that." I studied his face. The words were sentimental, but the tone was off, forced, like someone reading lines from a script. "You hated that trip," I said quietly. "You said it was boring. You wanted to come home early." His smile faltered. "I was a kid," he muttered. "Things look different now." There was something in his eyes then, something desperate, almost pleading. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, heavy and wrong. "We'd love to take you back," Edith said brightly. "A whole week in Miami, our treat." I stared at her. "Your treat?" "Yes," she said quickly. "We've already booked the hotel. We just need your yes." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of dust against glass. My pulse thudded in my ears. Something about this didn't make sense. They'd avoided me for months, barely said good morning. Now suddenly they wanted to go on a family vacation. Why now? I asked. Why the sudden generosity? Christopher gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Because we love you, Dad. The words hung in the air between us. Brittle. Unbelievable. I set my pen down carefully. When would this trip be? Next week, Edith said too quickly. Everything's arranged. I didn't answer. My mind moved quietly, cataloging details. Sudden trip, prepaid, 1 week, no consultation. The historian in me had spent 40 years teaching students to question timing and motive. People always reveal themselves in the patterns of their behavior. Christopher and Edith had been cold and distant for months. So what changed? That night, Edith insisted on cooking dinner. She never cooked. She was always too busy, even though she spent most of her time watching daytime television or on her phone. I sat at the dining table while she moved around my kitchen with uncomfortable familiarity, opening cabinets and drawers like she'd been waiting for the chance to rearrange my life. The smell of butter and garlic filled the room, rich but heavy. Christopher poured wine with a shaky hand. "It's a nice night," he said. "Fayette," I replied mildly, watching the way he avoided my eyes. I accepted the glass of wine but didn't drink. He was nervous. He always was lately. There were small signs. His tremor when I asked questions, his habit of deleting text messages seconds after reading them, the way Edith always spoke for him. When she finally sat down, she folded her napkin neatly on her lap, cutting her chicken into precise, even squares. She ate like a surgeon, every motion calculated. "Francis," she said between bites, "your life insurance policy is quite substantial. You got it? 500,000, right?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "How do you know the amount?" She smiled, unbothered. "Christopher mentioned it once. Just conversation." I looked at my son. He didn't look up. His knife scraped the plate, slow and rhythmic. The sound made my stomach turn. "Funny conversation to have," I said. My voice came out calmer than I felt. "Most people don't discuss death at dinner." Edith laughed lightly. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. I was just saying you've been very responsible. Planning ahead. Not everyone your age does that." Her eyes gleamed with something sharp. Admiration or calculation, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. I set down my fork. "I haven't been sleeping well lately," I said suddenly, watching their reaction. "My heart feels strange sometimes, like a flutter." Christopher's head snapped up, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Interest? Excitement? He caught himself quickly. "You should see a doctor, Dad. Maybe get checked out." Edith's smile was too smooth. "You look fine, Francis. Probably just stress." They exchanged a glance then, brief but loaded. The kind of silent communication people share when they're lying together about something. My chest tightened, but not from any heart condition. After dinner, they retreated downstairs to their room. I stayed where I was, staring at the empty plates. Then I saw it, a stack of printed documents half hidden beneath the mail pile. I pulled them out carefully. Flight confirmations, 3 tickets to Miami, Tuesday morning. One in my name. They hadn't even bothered to ask before booking. The night stretched long and cold. I sat in my study, the lamplight yellow and weak, holding an old photograph of Christopher as a boy. 7 years old, gap-toothed, smiling at the camera with that innocent kind of love that only children can give. His arms were wrapped around my neck. He'd called me his hero once. When did that change? I thought about all the small moments that might have led here. The first time he borrowed money and didn't pay it back. The first time he lied about a business trip. The first time Edith smiled at me like I was an obstacle instead of family. Maybe this wasn't sudden at all. Maybe it was years in the making. People reveal their truths in fragments, in slips of the tongue, in the way they look at you when they think you're not watching. And now all those fragments were starting to fit together. By dawn, I'd made my decision. When Christopher knocked on my door the next morning, his face was too bright, his cheer too practiced. "Morning, Dad," he said. "So what do you think about Miami?" I looked up from my desk, meeting his eyes. "I'll go." Relief washed over his face like a tide. Then something else flickered there. Satisfaction. "That's great," he said. "You won't regret it." I smiled faintly. We'll see. After he left, I began to pack. Slowly, deliberately. Socks, shirts, books, my medication bottles. I paused over those. Heart pills, blood pressure tablets, sleeping aids. I read each label twice. Edith's voice echoed in my mind. You look fine, Francis. Probably just stress. I placed the bottles carefully into my carry-on instead of my suitcase. Just in case. A small precaution. A teacher's habit. A survivor's instinct. The suitcase clicked, shut. The room felt heavier somehow, the air dense with unspoken warnings. I took one last look around, saying, the bookshelves lined with history, the essays I'd graded, the photos of a life that used to feel solid. Something was coming. I could feel it. But whatever game they were playing, I would not be the naive old man they thought I was. I had spent a lifetime teaching people how to see the truth hidden in plain sight. This time the lesson was mine to give, and I was ready. The morning before the flight smelled of rain and coffee. The sky over Orlando was the color of pewter, thick and heavy, pressing down on the neighborhood like a lid. I watched it from my kitchen window while stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The spoon clinked against the mug, steady and rhythmic, the kind of sound that fills silence when you don't know what else to do with your hands. Downstairs, I could hear them moving, drawers opening, zippers closing, muffled voices. Edith's laughter, light, artificial, floated up the stairs like perfume. I wondered if Christopher could still tell when she was faking it. Or maybe he didn't care anymore. Maybe they'd both become too comfortable in their lies. The flight was tomorrow. I had less than 24 hours before I'd be sitting next to them on a plane bound for Miami. I still hadn't decided whether I'd survive that flight or not. I wasn't being paranoid. Not anymore. Paranoia was blind suspicion without evidence. But I had evidence. Small things maybe, but small things add up. I'd built a career teaching students how to find truth in fragments, to study letters, receipts, photographs, and journals for the story between the lines. History, I always said, isn't in the big declarations. It's in the margins. It's in what people try to hide. And my son was hiding something. The signs were everywhere. His nervous laughter, the way Edith always spoke for him, the sudden vacation, the pre-purchased tickets, the offhand mention of my insurance policy, as if that were normal dinner conversation. And then there was Edith's tone when she'd said it, like she was testing the sound of my worth. $500,000, $500,000. The number echoed in my mind whenever I looked at them now. It made their smiles feel like masks. It made their laughter sound rehearsed. I wanted to believe they were just desperate, not evil, that they'd found themselves buried under debt and were too proud to ask for help. But something in my gut told me this was more than that. This was planned. That morning, I made a decision. If I was going to Miami, I'd go prepared. I'd observe, document, record, the way I'd taught my students to approach a research assignment. Not with emotion, but with precision. My life might depend on it. I started in the study, my sanctuary, my battlefield. On the desk sat an old notebook, leather-bound, filled with decades of half-finished thoughts and historical notes. I tore out a handful of blank pages and began a new section. At the top, I wrote in steady block letters, evidence log, Miami trip. Below that, I listed what I knew. Date of trip, booked by Edith without my consent. Tuesday 10 a.m. flight. Tickets, found printed in my name before I agreed, indicates assumption or coercion. Insurance reference, Edith mentioned exact amount of my policy, $500,000. Source, Christopher's disclosure. Behavioral changes, nervous energy, fake cheerfulness, excessive control of itinerary. Possible motive, financial gain upon my death. Medical vulnerability, discussion of heart issues, subtle encouragement to see doctor. When I finished, I stared at the page for a long time. It looked absurd, like something written by a paranoid old man. But deep down, I knew it wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. I'd seen patterns like this before, not in my family, but in history. Power corrupts slowly. People justify monstrous things when desperation whispers sweet logic in their ears. It's for our future, they tell themselves. It's just one small step. until one small step becomes a cliff. The sound of footsteps pulled me out of my thoughts. Christopher appeared in the doorway, half-dressed, his tie crooked. "Hey, Dad, you up early?" "Old habits," I said. "Couldn't sleep." He lingered awkwardly, glancing at the notebook on my desk. "What's that?" "Notes," I replied. "Just something I'm working on." He nodded, pretending to be disinterested, but I saw his eyes flick toward the cover again before he turned away. "We'll head out around 8 tomorrow," he said. "Flight's at 10. You'll be packed, right?" "I'm ready," I said quietly. He smiled, relief flashing across his face. "That's great. It'll be good for all of us." When he left, I exhaled slowly. My pulse was steady again. I wasn't going to confront them. Yet, confrontation would only corner them. And cornered people make dangerous decisions. I would wait, watch, record. After he left, I checked the guest bedroom. Their room. I hadn't gone in there since they moved in, but curiosity outweighed hesitation. The door creaked open, revealing neatness that didn't fit their personalities. Edith had made the bed perfectly, hospital-tight corners. On the dresser, her perfume bottles were lined up like soldiers. Christopher's things were few. A watch, his phone charger, a wallet. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I found something anyway. Inside the nightstand drawer was a manila envelope, unsealed. I hesitated and then slid it open. Inside were printed bank statements. Not theirs, mine. Accounts I hadn't touched in months. They'd been looking, studying, planning. My hands trembled as I returned the papers exactly how I found them. I backed out of the room, shutting the door softly, pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. They were after something. By afternoon, I'd calmed down enough to think clearly again. I went for a walk around the block, the November air cool and damp against my skin. The neighborhood was quiet, retirees walking dogs, sprinklers ticking rhythmically across manicured lawns. Normal life. It felt foreign. My own house, my own family, felt like a set on a stage, and I was the only one who realized the play was about to turn tragic. When I returned, Edith was in the kitchen. She'd baked something. Banana bread, maybe. The smell was rich and warm, and for a second I almost believed we were a normal family again. "Smells good," I said. She turned, flashing that bright, polished smile. "Thank you, Francis. I thought I'd make something special. Before the trip." I nodded. "You seem excited." "Oh, I am," she said, slicing the loaf with meticulous care. "You deserve some fun." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. They sounded like a eulogy. Later that night, I placed a small digital recorder, one of those old devices I use for lectures, in my jacket pocket. I told myself it was just insurance. Irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become the historian of my own murder plot, recording the evidence as it unfolded. I slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments. The crash of waves, the flash of fire, the echo of Edith's voice saying, "You look fine, Francis." When I woke, the world felt off balance, like I'd woken up halfway through someone else's story. Tuesday arrived with fog so thick it blurred the world into grayscale. Christopher loaded the car while Edith checked her phone, thumbs moving quickly. I watched from the porch, the handle of my suitcase firm in my grip. My carry-on, with my medications and notebook, stayed close to my side. Christopher looked up. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," I said then. The drive to the airport was silent except for the wipers squeaking across the windshield. Edith's perfume filled the car, cloying and artificial. Christopher's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The radio murmured static until he shut it off. I studied them both. Christopher's jaw clenched whenever I looked at him. Edith's phone buzzed every few minutes. She'd type a message, glance at me, then delete it immediately. Once I caught sight of a name on her screen before she cleared it. A. Porter. I didn't recognize it, but the tone of secrecy made it important. I scribbled it in my notebook later, next to the other evidence. At the airport, things moved quickly. Too quickly. Christopher handled check-in, boarding passes, luggage. Edith hovered near me, smiling too wide. "You okay, Francis? You look pale." "I'm fine," I said, "just not used to travel anymore." She laughed lightly. Well, you'll be used to it soon. Her words lingered, wrong in a way I couldn't name. Security was a blur of lines, beeping scanners, and polite strangers who had no idea they were watching a man walking into a trap. We reached the gate an hour early. Christopher bought coffee. Edith scrolled at her phone. I pretended to nap, but my eyes were half open, watching everything. The gate attendant announced boarding. We stood. Edith touched my arm lightly. You okay? Yes, I said. Then, as we approached the jet bridge, something strange happened. A flight attendant, young, red-haired, eyes tired but alert, stopped mid-sentence when she saw me. Her gaze flicked from me to Edith, then back to me. I couldn't read her expression, but it wasn't casual recognition. It was alarm. When we stepped onto the plane, she met my eyes again. Sir, she said quietly, could I speak with you for a second? I hesitated. Edith turned, frowning. Is something wrong? The attendant smiled politely. Just routine, ma'am. Go ahead and take your seats. I followed her a few steps back toward the galley. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Please, don't get on this flight. Pretend you're sick. Say anything. Just get off. My breath caught. What? She glanced over her shoulder. I can't explain. Please, I'm begging you. Her voice trembled. Real fear. Not the kind people fake for attention. The kind that lives deep in the bones. Before I could reply, another attendant called her name, and she forced a smile, stepping away. I stood frozen, halfway between choice and disbelief. My son was watching me from the row ahead, expression unreadable. Edith tilted her head, smiling. Everything okay? I swallowed hard. Just needed a moment. But my hands were shaking. The historian in me, the part that cataloged motives and patterns, screamed for me to listen to the evidence. And now, even strangers were part of it. I nodded to the attendant. I'll follow your advice. Minutes later, I faked a coughing fit, pressed a hand to my chest, and told the staff I wasn't feeling well. They insisted on escorting me off to be checked by medical personnel. Edith protested at first, but when I doubled over convincingly, she stepped back, face pale. Christopher hovered uncertainly, then muttered something about calling me later. As I was led back into the terminal, I caught one last glimpse of them through the gate window. They were talking rapidly, faces tight. Edith's hands were shaking. 20 minutes later, while I sat in an airport medical room drinking water, the announcement came. Flight 412 to Miami has been delayed due to a technical issue. Please remain seated. An hour later, news spread like wildfire. Something had happened midair after takeoff. Details were scarce. The words mechanical failure and unresponsive aircraft flashed across every monitor. I sat frozen, coffee cooling in my hands, heart thundering. I should have been on that plane. The dawn that broke over Francis's small house was the color of old paper, pale, thin, and brittle. He hadn't slept. Every hour had been a slow turn of the clock, each tick echoing through his ribs like a quiet threat. The suitcase sat by the door, neat and unassuming, but it felt like a coffin waiting for its occupant. By 7:30, Christopher's black SUV was in the driveway, engine idling, exhaust curling up like a gray serpent. Edith stepped out first, sunglasses on despite the morning fog, her voice syrupy and bright. Ready, Dad? Big day ahead? Francis nodded and forced a small smile. Always ready for an adventure. Inside, he was cataloging every sound. The click of the trunk, the low murmur between the couple, the distinct metallic clink when Christopher locked the glove compartment. They drove through the sleeping suburb without music. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was strategic. Christopher kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed forward, jaw tense. Edith scrolled on her phone, thumbs moving too fast. When Francis glanced at the screen reflected in the window, he caught a line of text flash past. Final confirmation sent. He turned his gaze outside, pretending to admire the gray stretch of highway. Final confirmation for what? At the airport, everything unfolded with suspicious smoothness. Check-in was already done. Christopher handed him a printed boarding pass with a confident smile. I figured I'd handle all the online stuff for you. You hate typing those forms, remember? Francis accepted the paper, his heart tightening. The seat number was 14C. He remembered booking no seat at all. Security was routine, but he noted how Edith whispered to an attendant and flashed something on her phone to him. The man nodded too quickly. When Frances asked, she laughed. Oh, just asking about wheelchair assistance for you later. He let her laugh hang in the air without responding. At the gate, they had an hour before boarding. Christopher excused himself to grab coffee. Edith stayed, flipping through a glossy magazine. You'll love Miami way, she said lightly. You'll finally get some sun instead of that dusty little house. Frances smiled. Yes, if I get there. She froze for half a second, just half, but the pause was enough. Then came the quick recovery. Of course you'll get there, silly. Why wouldn't you? Christopher returned, 2 paper cups in hand. He gave Frances one. The lid was sealed, a cardboard sleeve hiding the heat. Frances hesitated. You remembered I don't take sugar? Of course, Christopher said smoothly. Black, just the way you like it. Frances raised the cup, inhaled. The scent was bitter, normal, but he didn't drink. He held it until it cooled, pretending to sip, nodding occasionally while his mind replayed every fragment of the past week. The forced trip, the pre-booked ticket, the insurance, the whispered messages. When boarding was called, Edith slipped her arm through his. Come on, Dad, we'll help you to your seat. The cabin smelled of recycled air and faint citrus. Frances took his assigned place by the aisle. Christopher sat beside him, Edith at the window. She pressed her phone into airplane mode, then tucked it deep into her purse. The engines roared to life. As the plane began its slow taxi, Frances noticed a flight attendant at the far end of the aisle looking directly at him. She was young, maybe late 20s, her uniform crisp but her face tight with unease. When their eyes met, she blinked once, sharply, then looked away. Moments later, she appeared beside them, leaning down as if checking the seatbelts. Her voice was low, urgent. Sir, she whispered, are you traveling alone? Before Frances could answer, Edith smiled too widely. No, he's with us, family. The attendant's eyes flicked between them. Then, in a tone only he could hear, she murmured, if anything feels wrong, say you're not well. I can help you get off. Frances stared at her, heart hammering. Why would I? But she was already gone, gliding down the aisle. Edith's hand tightened on his arm. She's new, probably confused you with someone else. Christopher chuckled, though it sounded forced. Yeah, maybe she thinks you're that guy from the commercial. Frances nodded, pretending to relax, but the historian in him recorded every detail. The tremor in Edith's grip, the tension behind Christopher's grin, the quickness of their breathing as the plane turned toward the runway. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. Flight 275 to Miami, preparing for takeoff. Frances glanced at the flight attendant again. She was standing near the front now, her hand gripping the bulkhead rail. When their eyes met a second time, she mouthed one clear word. Please. He didn't understand yet. Not fully. But instinct, older than logic, whispered that he shouldn't ignore her. The engines grew louder, the world outside beginning to blur. Frances pressed the call button. The call light pinged above his head, a soft chime in the charged air. Edith's smile stiffened. Christopher's knee bounced once, sharply. Everything okay, Dad? Christopher asked, his voice already dipped in warning. Frances didn't answer. The same flight attendant appeared almost instantly, as though she had been waiting for the signal. She crouched beside his seat, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of citrus soap on her skin. Sir, you pressed the call button, she asked, her tone calm, but her eyes flicking again toward the couple beside him. I'm feeling lightheaded, Frances said carefully. Maybe the cabin air. Might be best if I step out a moment before we take off. Edith's head snapped toward him. He's fine, she said too quickly. He just gets anxious sometimes. The attendant's gaze hardened, professional mask still in place. Let's have a quick check then, she replied, gesturing for Frances to unbuckle. We'll get you looked at before departure. Christopher's hands shot out, gripping the seat in front of him. He doesn't need... But the attendant's voice sliced clean through his protest. Sir, FAA procedure requires medical clearance if a passenger reports dizziness prior to takeoff. Please remain seated. Her authority was absolute. Christopher leaned back, jaw working silently. Frances rose on shaky legs, heart pounding. The other passengers barely noticed. just another elderly man being escorted off for precaution. As they walked down the aisle, the attendant's whisper brushed his ear. "Don't look back. Just keep walking." He didn't. They exited through the forward door into the jet bridge. The roar of the engines muted to a hum. Another crew member waited there with a wheelchair, but the attendant shook her head. "We're fine, he'll walk." When they reached the terminal, she guided him to an empty gate bench. Only then did her composure crack. "Mr. Green, that flight isn't safe for you." Francis stared. "What do you mean, not safe? Did you see something?" She hesitated, glancing toward the windows. Through the glass, the aircraft still sat at the gate, passengers sealed inside, unaware. A message came through maintenance. Flagged baggage tags linked to an alert. Your name matched the file. The security note said you were a deceased claimant. I checked the manifest myself. Your ticket was purchased under a policy reference number, not a card. Someone filed paperwork that shouldn't exist. His stomach dropped. Deceased claimant. They planned it, he murmured. I don't know the details, she said, but something about that flight didn't add up. I couldn't let you board. The intercom crackled. Flight 275 preparing for immediate departure. The attendant straightened, suddenly all protocol again. Please stay here, sir. Security will speak to you in a moment. She hurried away before he could ask her name. Francis sat motionless, staring at the thin layer of condensation on the window. The plane began to reverse from the gate, engines spooling louder, a gleaming cylinder sliding toward the runway. Christopher's face appeared briefly in one of the small oval windows, expression unreadable in the glare. Edith beside him, her head turned away. Minutes dragged, then a commotion near the counter. A supervisor rushing over, headset crackling. Two security officers jogged past. The supervisor barked into his mic, "Cancel, push back, stop the taxi." But it was too late. The aircraft was already a silver speck moving down the tarmac. Francis rose, gripping the armrest of the chair to steady himself. Somewhere deep in his chest, dread twisted into something colder. A historian's certainty that the next event in the sequence was already written. 5 minutes later, the airport screens flickered. Flight 275, delayed. Then the word changed. Flight 275, incident reported. A gasp rippled through the terminal. Phones came out. Voices rose. The world around Francis slowed into fragments. The echo of footsteps. The muffled sobs of a woman on her phone, the mechanical announcement calling for calm. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched the horizon through the glass, the gray sky shuddering with distant smoke. The smoke rising from the horizon that morning never left Francis's memory. Even days later, it haunted him, the way it curled upward, gray and silent against the bright Florida sky. The way people at the terminal whispered, half hysterical, half in disbelief. He sat in a sterile office now, 4 days after the incident, under buzzing fluorescent lights that made everything feel unreal. The FBI seal glared from the wall behind the agents across from him. A paper cup of coffee had gone cold between his hands. Agent Miller, the older of the two, leaned forward. "Mr. Green, we appreciate your patience. We know this is difficult." Francis nodded absently. Difficult wasn't the right word. Impossible felt closer. "The flight you were booked on experienced a catastrophic systems failure mid-air," the agent continued. "The aircraft was forced to make an emergency descent into the ocean. So far, no survivors have been confirmed." The words were clinical, precise. But Francis heard the tremor underneath. He swallowed hard. Christopher, Edith. The younger agent Torres shifted uneasily. "Their names are on the manifest, yes. We're still recovering remains. But there's something we need to clarify with you." Miller slid a file across the table. Inside lay a copy of an insurance form. Francis's own name printed in bold letters. He frowned, flipping the page. A death certificate. His death certificate. Date of death next week. "What is this?" "That's what we'd like to know," Miller said. "This form was filed 3 weeks ago through a private broker. The beneficiary listed is your son, Christopher Green. Secondary beneficiary, Edith Green." Francis stared at the paper until the letters blurred. "They filed a death claim before I died." Correct, Torres confirmed. And it wasn't the only one. There's a second policy from a different company. Larger amount. $500,000. Both were cross-referenced to the same banking information. Francis closed his eyes. The wine at dinner, Edith's question about the policy, the trembling in Christopher's hands. The plan had been perfect. If the plane went down, no one would question why an elderly man had a heart. Attack mid-flight. His family and the grieving son and daughter-in-law would collect quietly, maybe even speak fondly at a memorial service. He almost laughed. The historian in him wanted to take notes on human deceit, the way greed evolved like an infection. But all he felt was hollow. Miller's voice cut through his thoughts. We're investigating the possibility that the aircraft sabotage was connected to multiple fraudulent insurance claims. Your son's name appears on several flagged accounts tied to offshore transfers. Edith Green handled documentation and logistics for a medical supply firm, a perfect cover for false records. Torres added, we believe the Miami trip was a setup. You were meant to be on that flight as a casualty. They'd already reported you missing in a predated statement to the insurer. Francis leaned back, dizzy. So they were planning to kill me and die themselves? Not necessarily, Miller said. There's evidence they switched seats just before boarding. Witnesses saw Edith arguing with the gate agent over an upgrade request. It's possible they arranged to deplane after you boarded. He rubbed his temples. You're saying they never intended to go to Miami. That's our theory. Silence stretched between them, thick and airless. The hum of the overhead lights grew unbearable. Finally, Francis whispered, why me? Why their own father? Miller didn't answer immediately. He closed the file and clasped his hands. Because you had something they wanted, and you trusted them enough to hand it over. Outside, the Florida sun blazed mercilessly over the funeral building's glass facade. Francis stood on the steps, the heat wrapping around him like punishment. Cars passed, distant sirens wailed. Life continued as if nothing had happened. He took the old photograph from his wallet, the same one he'd held in his study that night. Christopher at 7, missing a front tooth, clutching a paper airplane. His grin stretched from ear to ear. Francis stared at it until the edges curled in his damp hands. Somewhere along the years between that photo and this nightmare, his son had disappeared, swallowed by debts, ambition, or Edith's hunger for control. And yet, part of him refused to accept that everything was gone. Historians, after all, didn't believe in sudden endings. Every disaster left artifacts, survivors, footnotes. He would find the truth buried in the wreckage no matter how deep. The next morning, Francis sat at his kitchen table with a pot of coffee gone lukewarm and a dozen printouts spread before him. The FBI had returned his belongings the night before, his passport, his laptop, his wallet. But they'd also given him something else, a copy of the insurance filings that had started it all. He turned the papers over and over, tracing the names, the forged signatures, the false medical reports stating he'd been diagnosed with late-stage heart failure. The handwriting wasn't his, it wasn't even close, but the signature was eerily familiar. Edith's looping cursive. He felt anger stir, not the hot kind that burned out quickly, but the cold, steady kind that sharpened the mind. He'd seen that same handwriting on birthday cards, grocery lists, 1,000 small domestic gestures that now felt poisoned. He pulled out his old laptop, the one he'd used during his teaching days. It still booted up slowly, the fan wheezing like an old lung, but it worked. Francis wasn't a technical man, yet decades of grading online submissions had taught him patience and persistence. He started cross-checking email timestamps, payment receipts, and insurance correspondence. The trail was messy, but familiar patterns began to emerge. There were transfers to a shell company under a meaningless name, EMN Logistics, and an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. Edith's initials. But then something strange surfaced. An email sent 2 days after the crash from Edith's personal address. Subject, it's done. Recipient, a redacted address, obscured in the forwarded version the FBI had given him. Timestamp, 2:47 a.m., the night after the wreck. Francis's pulse quickened. He opened the email. It was short. Only one line. Phase 2 starts now. Wire by Tuesday. No sign-off. No emotion. just the cold, mechanical tone of someone who thought the job was complete. He read it again and again until his eyes blurred. Phase 2. It didn't sound like something a woman about to die would write. He checked the metadata. The message had been sent from an IP address registered not in Florida, but in Nassau, the Bahamas. He leaned back in his chair, mind racing. Edith was alive. And if Edith had survived, Christopher might have too. The thought hit him like a blow, but another followed, sharper still. What if they planned to vanish? What if the crash, or at least their presence on that flight, was only part of the illusion? The insurance payout wouldn't go through without proof of death. But if both died, no one could contest the claim. No witnesses, no trail, except for him. He pushed the papers aside and picked up his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed Agent Miller's number from the card he'd been given. "Miller," came the gruff answer. "It's Francis Green," he said. "Check the timestamp on the evidence you gave me." Edith sent an email 2 days after the crash, from the Bahamas. There was a pause. "That's not possible, Mr. Green. It is possible," Francis cut in. "It's right here. You missed it." More silence. Then the faint sound of rapid typing. "Hold on," Miller muttered. "You still have that email open?" "Yes." "Forward it to me immediately." Francis did. Minutes stretched into an hour before Miller called back. "You're right," the agent said finally, voice tense. "The IP's legit. Our cyber unit just confirmed the origin point. Nassau. The sender used a VPN, but we can track the device ID. Mr. Green, if this is accurate, it means at least one of them didn't board that plane." Francis closed his eyes. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt old. Ancient, even. The kind of old that came from realizing how long deceit could hide behind familiar faces. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Miller said, "we follow the money, and we find out who she wired." That night, Francis sat in his study once again, surrounded by the same shadows that had comforted him for decades. The old house creaked with the evening wind. He stared at the photograph of Christopher on his desk. He remembered his son's small voice, years ago, asking if history ever forgave people who betrayed others. Francis had told him, history doesn't forgive or punish. It records. It remembers. Now, looking at that same boy's adult handwriting on forged documents, he realized something else. History also repeats, especially when greed writes the script. He opened a new notebook and wrote a single line on the first page. "Evidence is the only antidote to betrayal." Then he began listing everything he knew: dates, receipts, witness accounts, even the flight attendant's warning. His old historian instincts flared alive again, because if the ocean looked calm that morning, deceptively calm, like the face of a liar who has already told too many stories. Francis stood on the balcony of a modest hotel in Nassau, the wind carrying the faint scent of salt and engine oil. Behind him inside the room, his tablet displayed the latest email from Agent Miller. "Confirmed, transfer routed to a private account under alias C.H. Wallace. Believed to be Christopher Green. Funds frozen. Proceed with caution." It had taken 3 months, countless late-night calls, and the patience of an old historian piecing together the truth. The FBI had moved slowly, bound by treaties and jurisdiction, but Francis had not. He had traced the money through layers of shell companies until he found what the agents had missed: a rental property on a quiet Nassau street, leased under a false name 2 weeks before the crash. The same week Christopher and Edith had insisted on the Miami trip. Francis walked there now, his cane steady on the uneven pavement. The sun glared off the whitewashed walls and coral-colored roofs. Locals passed without a glance. To them, he was just another aging tourist. But to him, this was the final chapter. The house stood near the end of the street, its shutters closed against the noon heat. A small silver car was parked outside. He knew that car. He'd seen it in a photo on Edith's social media months ago, back when she'd still been pretending to be a devoted wife. Francis's hand trembled as he raised his phone. "I found them," he told Miller quietly. "Don't approach," the agent warned. "Local authorities are en route. Stay where you are." But Francis had never been good at waiting. He crossed the street slowly, each step measured, deliberate. Through the half-drawn curtains he could see movement. 2 figures in the dimness. Christopher's familiar slouch. Edith's quick, efficient gestures. They looked different somehow, thinner, their skin burned darker by the island sun. But alive. He tapped on the door, once, twice. A pause, then Edith's voice muffled but unmistakable. Who is it? History, Francis said. The silence that followed was pure electric terror. The door opened an inch. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw fear there, not calculation. Francis, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house smelled of damp wood and stale air conditioning. Christopher stood frozen near the table, a laptop open beside a stack of cash and passports. You're supposed to be dead, Christopher whispered. Francis looked at him for a long time, every fatherly memory clashing with every betrayal. You almost got your wish. Edith's composure cracked. We didn't mean for it to go that far. The flight, something went wrong. Something went right, Francis interrupted. The attendant saw the paperwork. She saved me. Christopher's voice broke. Dad, please. No, Francis said quietly. Don't call me that. Outside, the wail of sirens began to build, faint but growing. Blue lights flashed through the shutters. Edith turned toward the back door. We can still run, she hissed. Christopher didn't move. His shoulders sagged. It's over. When the police burst in moments later, Francis didn't flinch. He stood aside as officers swarmed the room, cuffing the two people he had once called family. Edith struggled, cursing. Christopher didn't resist. Agent Miller arrived soon after, his face tight but satisfied. You did well, Mr. Greenvauer, he said. We'll take it from here. Francis nodded, but he didn't feel triumphant. As they led his son past him in handcuffs, their eyes met one last time. There was no hate there, only something far sadder. Understanding. Weeks later, back home in his study, Francis returned to his papers. The walls smelled again of lemon polish and age. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after storms. A package arrived one morning from the FBI. Case documents, photographs, transcripts. He stacked them neatly on his desk but didn't open them. Some truths, he decided, didn't need revisiting. Instead, he turned to the notebook he'd started months ago. The first page still held the words he'd written in anger. Evidence is the only antidote to betrayal. Beneath it, he wrote a new line. But forgiveness is the only cure for memory. He didn't know if he believed it yet, but he wanted to. In the afternoon light, Francis stood by his window, watching dust float through golden air. His reflection in the glass looked older, thinner, but somehow steadier. History, he thought, isn't just what survives, it's what we choose to remember. And he finally chose peace. End of story.